My name is Clara May Whitaker, and I'm 76 years old now, sitting on the weathered front porch of my small home, nestled in the rolling hills of eastern Tennessee. The air carries the scent of pine and damp earth, mingling with the faint sweetness of honeysuckle that climbs the trellis nearby. The quiet of these mountains has been my sanctuary for decades, a place where I've pieced together a life from the fragments of a childhood shattered long ago. Here in Willow Creek, I'm known as Miss Clara, the woman who tends her garden. With care, knits blankets for the church bazaar, and teaches Sunday school with a gentle smile that hides the weight of my past. Few would guess the shadows I've walked through to stand here today, the secrets I've carried for over 60 years. Telling this story stirs memories that still ache like old wounds, raw and tender despite the passage of time. It's not easy to lay bare the pain I've kept locked away, but I'm sharing it now, not for my own sake. I've learned to live with my scars, but for those who, like me, had their childhood stolen by someone they trusted. If you're watching this, I'd be deeply grateful if you'd like the video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. Please share in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to connect with you, to know this story has reached you wherever you are. Perhaps my words will give someone the courage to break their silence before it becomes a lifelong cage, to find a way out of the darkness that threatens to consume them. This is for the children who feel alone, for the survivors who think their voices will never be heard. My story is one of pain, yes, but also of redemption, of finding light in the deepest shadows. I grew up in a modest clapboard house by the Holston River, just outside the small town of Willow Creek. The house was painted a fading yellow, its paint peeling like old skin under the relentless Tennessee sun. A sagging porch wrapped around the front, where my mother, Lila, kept jars of wildflowers, black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace, picked from the riverbank on her walks. We weren't wealthy, far from it, but we had enough to get by in a town where everyone knew your name and your business. My father, Amos, worked long hours at the sawmill, his hands calloused and splintered from handling timber, his broad shoulders stooped from years of labor. My mother took in sewing, her nimble fingers mending shirts and dresses for neighbors, and sold jars of blackberry jam at the general store, her pride evident in every carefully labeled jar. I was the middle child, caught between my older brother, Tommy, who was 12 when it all began, and my younger sister, Beth, a bright-eyed 6-year-old with a laugh that could light up the gloomiest day. Our life was simple, woven from the small joys that defined rural Tennessee in the 1950s. The river was our playground, its cool waters a refuge on sweltering summer days. I'd spend hours with Tommy, skipping stones across the surface, or chasing fireflies with Beth as the sky turned to dusk, their tiny lights flickering like stars we could hold. My mother's voice, soft and melodic, would drift from the kitchen as she sang hymns. Amazing Grace was her favorite, while kneading dough or pinning fabric. My father, though often tired, would tell us stories of his boyhood, of fishing trips with his own father, his eyes crinkling with rare smiles. We were poor in possessions but rich in moments, until a cold November day in 1959 when I was 10 years old changed everything. It began with a cough, dry and persistent, that had plagued Mama for days. I'd noticed her growing quieter, her movements slower, but she brushed off my concerns with a tired smile. "Just a cold. Clara May," she'd say, ruffling my hair. But that morning, I found her slumped in the kitchen, her face pale as the flour on the counter, her breathing shallow and ragged. Her lips had a strange bluish tint that sent a chill through me. "Mama, you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling as I touched her fever-hot hand. She managed a weak smile, her eyes glassy. "Just a cold, darlin'. Don't you worry." But it wasn't just a cold. By noon, she was burning up, struggling to breathe, her coughs tearing through her frail frame. My father, who rarely missed a day at the sawmill, was fetched by a neighbor, his face tight with fear as he rushed into the house. He took one look at Mama and scooped her into his arms, wrapping her in a quilt. "I'm taking her to the hospital," "In Knoxville," he said, his voice steady but his eyes wild with panic. "Clara, you and Tommy look after Beth. Uncle Roy will stay with you." Uncle Roy was my father's older brother, a widower who'd moved in with us 2 years earlier after his wife died of tuberculosis. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s with a gravelly voice and gray eyes that seemed to pierce right through you. He worked odd jobs, fixing fences, hauling lumber, but spent most evenings with a flask of whiskey, his temper flaring when the liquor took hold. His gaze had always unsettled me, lingering too long, making my skin prickle with unease I couldn't name. "I'll keep things in order," he said, clapping Dad on the shoulder as he carried Mama to the truck. Dad nodded, too distracted to notice the way I shrank back, my hands twisting in my apron. The hospital was a 2-hour drive, and the roads were slick with early snow, the first flakes of the season dusting the ground like ash. As Dad's old Ford truck rattled down the dirt path, its taillights fading into the gray, a hollow dread settled in my chest. Tommy and Beth were oblivious, playing checkers by the fire, their laughter a stark contrast to the fear gnawing at me. Uncle Roy sat on the porch, sipping from his flask, his eyes fixed on the river's dark current. I busied myself with chores, sweeping the floor, washing dishes, trying to keep the panic at bay, to pretend everything was normal. That evening, as the sky darkened and snow fell in soft, heavy flakes, I tucked Beth into bed with a story about a princess who lived in a castle made of clouds. Her small hand clung to mine, her eyes heavy with sleep. Tommy fell asleep soon after, sprawled across his bed, exhausted from a day of worry. I was alone in the kitchen, scrubbing pots, when Uncle Roy came inside. His boots thudded against the wooden floor, each step echoing in my chest. The air seemed to thicken, heavy with something I couldn't name but instinctively feared. "Clara," he said, his voice low and slurred from whiskey. "Come sit with me." I froze, my hands submerged in soapy water, the rag trembling in my grip. "I'm almost done," I mumbled, praying he'd leave, that the moment would pass. But he didn't. He crossed the room, his shadow looming over me like a storm cloud. "You're growing up fast, ain't you?" he said, his hand brushing my shoulder, lingering too long. My heart pounded, a frantic rhythm that drowned out everything else. I wanted to run, to scream, but I was 10, small and powerless against a grown man's strength. What happened that night is a blur of pain and shame, fragments I've spent decades trying to piece together or bury, his rough hands where they shouldn't have been, the sharp sting of violation, the weight of his body pinning me to the floor of his room at the back of the house, the smell of whiskey and sweat, his hot breath against my ear as he whispered, "You're the woman of the house now, Clara." The words seared into my soul, a brand I couldn't scrub away. I don't know when I passed out, whether from shock or pain, but I woke in my own bed, my body aching, my nightgown stained with blood. Beth slept beside me, her small breaths steady and innocent, a cruel reminder of the childhood I'd lost in a single night. The next morning, I scrubbed myself raw in the wash basin, the cold water biting my skin as I tried to erase the evidence of what had happened. My hands shook as I changed the sheets, hiding them in the laundry pile before anyone could see. I moved through the house like a ghost, preparing breakfast, braiding Beth's hair, avoiding Tommy's curious glances. When Dad's truck pulled into the yard at noon, I ran to the porch, my heart leaping with hope that Mama was with him. But he was alone, his face hollow, his eyes red and swollen. He took off his cap, clutching it against his chest like a shield. "Your mama's gone," he said, his voice breaking. "Pneumonia took her too fast. The doctors couldn't do nothing." The world tilted, and I clung to the porch railing to keep from collapsing. My mother, my anchor, the woman who sang hymns and tucked wildflowers into my hair, was gone. And in her absence, I carried a secret too heavy to bear, a violation that made me feel complicit, dirty, unworthy of the grief I felt. Dad hugged me, his flannel shirt damp with snow and tears, and I wanted to tell him everything, to unburden myself of the horror. But Uncle Roy's eyes watched from the doorway, a silent warning that kept my lips sealed. The days that followed were a haze of grief and fear. Neighbors filled our kitchen with casseroles, cornbread, and pies, their voices soft with condolences as they patted my shoulder or squeezed my hand. Tommy cried until his eyes were raw, his anger flaring at anyone who tried to comfort him. Beth, too young to grasp the finality of death, kept asking when Mama would come home, her questions like knives twisting in my chest. I moved through the motions, cooking meals, washing clothes, keeping Beth and Tommy fed and dressed, because it was the only way to keep from unraveling. Normalcy became my refuge, a fragile shield against the terror that lived in our house. Uncle Roy's presence was a constant threat. He watched me from across the room, his gray eyes sharp and predatory, a reminder of his whispered warnings. "This stays between us, Clara. Your daddy can't handle more pain. You don't want to break him, do you?" His words twisted my love for my father into a weapon, binding me to silence. I was 10, too young to understand the manipulation, too scared to test whether anyone would believe me. Who would take the word of a child over a grown man? A respected member of the community who fixed fences and helped neighbors during harvest. The abuse continued, always when Dad was at the sawmill or when Tommy and Beth were out of the house, playing with friends, fishing at the river, or visiting neighbors. Uncle Roy was careful, methodical, choosing moments when no one would notice. He'd call me to the shed to help with tools, or to his room to fetch something, his voice leaving no room for refusal. I learned to dissociate, my mind fleeing to memories of Mama's stories, tales of brave girls who outwitted giants, or the sound of the river's gentle flow, while my body endured the unbearable. I wore long sleeves to hide the bruises on my arms, avoided mirrors to escape the stranger staring back at me, her eyes hollow and old beyond her years. At 10, I was no longer a child but a prisoner in my own home, trapped by shame and fear. By the spring of 1960, I was 11, and my body was beginning to change, small curves announcing an early puberty that filled me with dread. Uncle Roy noticed, his comments growing bolder, his gaze more invasive. "You're looking more like Lila every day," he'd say, his voice thick with something that made my stomach churn. I started binding my chest with strips of cloth torn from an old sheet, wearing Mama's oversized dresses to hide myself. But it was useless. His attention only intensified, his hands lingering longer, his words more possessive. I began to sleep with a kitchen knife under my pillow, not because I thought I could use it, but because it made me feel a fraction less helpless. I invented excuses, headaches, chores, sudden errands, to avoid being alone with him, but he always found a way. One afternoon in April, Dad was in town buying seeds for the garden we'd started in Mama's memory, a patch of vegetables and flowers she'd loved. Tommy and Beth were at the river with the neighbors' kids fishing for catfish. I was sweeping the porch, the rhythmic scrape of the broom a small anchor in the chaos of my life, when Uncle Roy called from inside. "Clara, need your help with something," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. My heart pounded, a familiar panic rising, but something inside me snapped. I was tired of fear, tired of pain, tired of carrying a secret that was eating me alive. "I'm busy," I said, gripping the broom so tightly my knuckles whitened. My voice was small but defiant, a spark of rebellion I hadn't known I possessed. His face darkened, and he strode onto the porch, grabbing my wrist with enough force to make me gasp. "Don't you sass me, girl," he growled, yanking me toward the house. I fought back, swinging the broom at him, the wooden handle striking his arm. It was like hitting a wall, but I kept struggling, scratching and kicking, desperate to break free. He dragged me inside, his grip bruising, his breath hot with whiskey. Then came the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Dad's truck. Uncle Roy froze, his hand still clamped around my wrist, his eyes narrowing. "Not a word," he hissed, shoving me toward the door so hard I stumbled. I caught myself on the wall, my breath ragged, as Dad climbed out of the truck, a sack of seeds slung over his shoulder. His eyes narrowed when he saw me, my hair disheveled, my wrist red, my face pale with fear. "Clara, what's wrong?" he asked, setting the sack down, his voice tight with concern. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Fear choked me. Fear of not being believed, of breaking our already fractured family, of causing Dad more pain when he was still grieving Mama. "Nothing," I whispered, but my voice trembled, betraying me. Dad's gaze shifted to Uncle Roy, who stood in the doorway, his face a mask of calm. "Just a little accident," Roy said smoothly, his smile forced. "Clara tripped while sweepin'." Dad didn't respond, but his eyes lingered on me, searching for something I wasn't ready to give. He nodded slowly, but there was a hardness in his expression I hadn't seen before, a suspicion that hadn't been there until now. The next few weeks were tense, like the heavy air before a thunderstorm. Dad started coming home earlier from the sawmill, his presence a quiet barrier between me and Uncle Roy. He noticed things, the way I flinched when Roy entered a room, the nightmares that woke me screaming, the bruises I couldn't always hide. He'd catch my eye across the dinner table, his brow furrowed, but he never asked directly. I could feel his questions hanging between us, unspoken but heavy, like the damp air that clung to Willow Creek in spring. Uncle Roy grew cautious, his movements more calculated, but he didn't stop. He'd wait for moments when Dad was distracted, checking the garden, fixing a fence, or when Tommy and Beth were out. He'd corner me in the shed or the kitchen, his voice low and threatening. "You think your daddy'll believe you over me?" he'd say, his fingers digging into my arm. "You'll ruin this family, Clara." His words were a cage, locking me in silence. But the spark of defiance I'd felt that day on the porch grew, a tiny flame refusing to be snuffed out. One night in May, when the air was thick with the scent of coming rain, it all came to a head. Tommy and Beth were asleep, their soft snores drifting through the thin walls. I was in the living room, mending a pair of Tommy's pants by the flickering light of a kerosene lamp, the needle trembling in my fingers. Uncle Roy entered, his steps unsteady from drinking, his shadow swallowing the light. "Clara," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Come here." I stood, clutching the needle, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. "No," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. His eyes narrowed and he lunged, grabbing my arm with a force that made me cry out. The needle fell, clattering against the floor as I struggled against him, kicking and clawing. "You little—" he started, but his words were cut off by a roar. What the hell is going on? Dad's voice boomed from the doorway. He'd been in the shed checking the tools, or so he'd said. Now I wonder if he'd been waiting, watching, his suspicions finally boiling over. Uncle Roy released me, stepping back with a forced laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Just playing, Amos," he said, his voice thick with false ease. "She's too serious for her own good." Dad's face was stone, his eyes burning with a fury I'd never seen. That's not what I saw. The room grew still, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the wood stove. I stood frozen, trembling, unable to speak. My heart caught between relief and terror. "Clara, go to your room," Dad said, his voice low but firm, his gaze never leaving Roy. I hesitated, torn between the urge to flee and the fear of what would happen when I left. "Go," he repeated, sharper this time. I dropped the mending and ran to the hallway, stopping just out of sight, my breath shallow as I pressed myself against the wall. "What were you doing to my daughter?" Dad's voice was a growl, low and dangerous. Roy laughed again, but it was nervous, unsteady. "You're imagining things, Amos. She's just a kid, clumsy as hell." "Don't lie to me," Dad snapped. "I've seen the marks on her arms, the fear in her eyes, the way she wakes up screaming at night. You think I'm blind?" His voice rose, trembling with barely contained rage. Roy's tone shifted, conciliatory but laced with defiance. "She's confused, Amos. Lost her mama, acting out. You know how kids are. Shut up!" Dad roared, and a crash followed. Furniture overturning, a glass shattering against the floor. I covered my ears, but I couldn't block out the sounds of their fight. Grunts of effort, the thud of fists, the scrape of boots on wood. A sickening crack, louder than the rest, then silence, heavy and final. My legs trembled as I crept back to the doorway, driven by a mix of dread and desperate hope. Dad stood panting, his fists bloody, his chest heaving. Uncle Roy lay motionless on the floor, a pool of blood spreading beneath his head where it had struck the iron stove's sharp corner. The lamp's light cast harsh shadows, making the scene look like something from a nightmare. "Clara," Dad said, his voice breaking when he saw me, his eyes wide with shock. "I told you to stay in your room. Is he—" I couldn't finish, my voice a whisper. Dad knelt, pressing his fingers to Roy's neck, his face grim as he nodded. "Go wake Tommy," he ordered, his voice steadying into a practical tone that belied the chaos around us. "Tell him you didn't hear nothing. You were asleep. Understand? No matter what happens, you didn't see or hear anything." I nodded, tears streaming down my face, a strange mix of relief and terror flooding me. The nightmare that had haunted me for months was over, but a new one was beginning, one where my father carried the weight of a life taken to protect me. The official story was simple, crafted in the quiet hours that followed. Uncle Roy, drunk as he often was, had slipped and hit his head on the stove. A tragic accident, the kind that could happen to anyone who drank too much. The sheriff, a burly man named Carl who'd worked with Dad at the sawmill, arrived after midnight, his lantern casting flickering light across the kitchen. He asked few questions, his eyes soft with sympathy for a family already scarred by loss. "Looks like a bad fall, Amos," he said, scribbling in his notebook. "Happens too often with folks who hit the bottle hard." The town doctor, an older man with trembling hands, confirmed the cause of death: a fractured skull from impact. No one questioned the story. No one suspected foul play. Or if they did, they chose silence, respecting the grief of a widower and his children. The wake was small, held in the church hall 2 days later. A handful of townsfolk attended, neighbors who'd known Roy from his odd jobs, a few old friends from the sawmill. No one shed tears. Roy had never been well liked, his temper and drinking keeping most at a distance. I stood beside Dad, holding Beth's hand, my face a mask of composure I didn't feel. Tommy, now 13, stood tall but silent, his eyes darting to Dad's bruised knuckles. The simple pine coffin was lowered into the earth in the town cemetery, the same place where we'd buried Mama just months before. As the preacher spoke of eternal rest, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, as if the earth itself was swallowing the terror that had haunted me. But the relief was tinged with guilt, with the knowledge that Dad had crossed a line to protect me, a line that would mark him forever. That night, after the burial, Dad called me to the kitchen. The stove gleamed, scrubbed clean of blood by Tommy and me while Dad spoke to the sheriff. The room felt different now, quieter, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Dad sat, at the table, his hands folded, his face etched with exhaustion. "Clara," he said, his voice heavy, "I won't ask you to tell me what happened. Not now. Maybe not ever, if you don't want to. But I need you to know I did what I had to protect you. A father protects his children no matter what." "I know, Dad," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "We're safe now." The words felt like a vow, a promise to carry the secret with him, to shield our family from further pain. He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering mine, and for the first time since Mama's death, I felt a flicker of safety, a sense that the worst was behind us. Life slowly stitched itself back together, though the seams were fragile. Dad threw himself into providing for us, taking on extra shifts at the sawmill and learning tasks that had been Mama's, cooking cornbread, mending socks, braiding Beth's hair with clumsy fingers. The neighbors noticed, some raising eyebrows at a man doing women's work, but others respected his quiet determination. "Amos is doing right by his kids," I overheard Mrs. Jenkins say at the general store. "Not every man would." He insisted I return to school, determined I'd have a future beyond Willow Creek. "Your mama wanted you to be more than this town," he'd say, his voice firm. So do I. School was a small one-room building where children of all ages studied under Miss Clara Bell, a stern but kind teacher who smelled of lavender and kept a ruler on her desk. I'd always loved learning, but now it was a lifeline, a place to escape the memories that lingered in our house. I threw myself into books, finding solace in stories of faraway places, in numbers that always added up the same way. But I was different now, quieter, my eyes carrying a weight that set me apart from the other children. "Clara's got an old soul," Miss Clara Bell told Dad during a parent meeting, her brow furrowed. "She's bright, but she's carrying something heavy." At home, I took on more responsibilities, cooking meals and washing clothes, trying to fill the void Mama had left. Tommy helped with chores, chopping wood and tending the garden, his boyish energy tempered by a new seriousness. Beth, still too young to understand the depth of our loss, clung to me, her small hand slipping into mine whenever she felt unsure. I became their anchor, just as I'd been that night. But the effort drained me. At night, alone in the room I shared with Beth, I'd cry into my pillow, muffling the sobs so she wouldn't wake. The nightmares came often, flashes of Uncle Roy's hands, his voice, the weight of his body. I'd wake gasping, my heart racing, the knife under my pillow a cold comfort. In 1962, when I was 13, Dad made a decision that changed our lives. His cousin, Martha, a widow who ran a boarding house in Knoxville, had been visiting more often, her sharp eyes noticing the strain in our family. She was a tall woman with graying hair and a no-nonsense manner, but her heart was warm, her kitchen always smelling of cornbread and coffee. One Sunday, as we sat on the porch sipping sweet tea, she made her offer. "Amos, come live with me in Knoxville," she said. "The boarding house is too big for me alone, and the kids would have better schools. You could find work in the city, something easier on your back." Dad hesitated, running his hand over his stubbled chin. "This land's all I got, Martha. It's where Lila and I built our life." Martha didn't push, but her words were firm. "Nobody's saying sell it. Hire someone to tend it. Come back on weekends. Think of the kids, Amos. What future do they have here?" The idea took root slowly, discussed over dinners, weighed against the pull of the only home we'd known. Tommy and Beth were excited at the prospect of the city. Knoxville, with its 50,000 people, seemed like a metropolis to them. I was torn. The house held memories of Mama, of happier times, but also of terror, of nights I'd never forget. Leaving felt like both a betrayal and a chance to breathe. In July 1962, we packed up and moved. We took little: clothes, Mama's sewing box, a few photographs, the quilt she'd made for my bed. The rest stayed behind, along with a piece of ourselves. Martha's boarding house was a 2-story Victorian with creaking floors and a wide porch, filled with the chatter of boarders, traveling salesmen, young teachers, a retired preacher. The kitchen was the heart of the house, warm with the scent of cornbread and stew, and Martha welcomed us like her own. "You'll each have a room," she said, to Beth's delight, and Tommy's quiet nod. I was grateful for the space, for walls that didn't echo with memories of Uncle Roy. Knoxville was overwhelming. Bustling streets, cars honking, buildings taller than any tree in Willow Creek. The school was a brick building with separate classrooms for each grade, a far cry from Miss Clara Bell's one-room schoolhouse. I was the country girl in a sea of city kids, my patched dresses and thick accents setting me apart. The other girls, with their crisp blouses and confident chatter, seemed to belong to a different world. I kept to myself, sitting at the back of the class, speaking only when called on, avoiding recess by hiding in the library with books that offered escape: Anne of Green Gables, Little Women, stories of girls who faced trials and triumphed. Academically, I thrived. My teacher, Miss Evelyn, a young woman with a sharp mind and kind eyes, noticed my love for words. "You have a voice, Clara. she said, after reading my essay about the Holston River, its waters winding through my memories like a thread. Don't let it stay silent. Her words stirred something in me, a desire to be more than the girl who'd survived, to become someone who could shape her own story. Martha noticed my quietness, the way I flinched at sudden noises or shied away from the male boarders. She never pried, but her presence was a steady comfort. She taught me to bake her cornbread, to sew intricate patterns, but also to read the newspaper and balance a checkbook. A woman needs to know how to stand on her own, she'd say, her hands kneading dough with practiced ease. You're stronger than you think, Clara May. At 15, I confided in her. It was a quiet evening in her kitchen, the boarders out or asleep, the air warm with the scent of cinnamon from a pie cooling on the counter. We were shelling peas, the rhythmic pop of the pods a soothing backdrop. What happened with Uncle Roy? She asked suddenly, her voice gentle but piercing, her eyes meeting mine. I froze, the pea pod in my hand forgotten. No one had ever asked directly, not in the 3 years since his death. The words poured, out before I could stop them. Every painful detail, every buried memory, the shame and fear that had choked me for so long. She listened without interrupting, her face steady, but her eyes brimming with tears. When I finished, she set the bowl of peas aside and pulled me into a fierce embrace, her arms a fortress against the pain. It wasn't your fault, she said, her voice fierce. You were a child. He was the monster. She told me Dad had suspected for months, his guilt and rage spilling out to her after Roy's death. He carried that burden to protect you, she said. But you don't have to carry it anymore. That conversation was the first crack in the wall I'd built around my heart. It didn't erase the pain, but it made it bearable, like a wound finally allowed to breathe. For the first time, I felt seen, understood, no longer alone with my secret. I became a teacher at 19, after graduating from a normal school in Knoxville. My first job was at an elementary school in the city's outskirts, a small building not unlike the one in Willow Creek. Teaching gave me purpose, a way to protect and nurture children as I hadn't been. I poured myself into my students, teaching them to read, to write, to dream beyond the boundaries of their lives. Their laughter, their curiosity, healed something in me, piece by piece. In 1967, I met Daniel, a carpenter who came to repair the school's desks, his hands steady and his smile quiet but warm. He was 25 with dark hair and eyes that crinkled when he laughed, a man who spoke little but listened deeply. Our first conversation was about a wobbly desk, but he kept finding reasons to return, fixing a window, building shelves, always lingering to talk. I was cautious, my heart guarded by walls built from trauma. But his patience disarmed me. He'd bring me coffee from the diner, ask about my students, share stories of his own childhood in the Smoky Mountains. You're different, Clara, he said once, his voice soft. Not like anyone I've met. Our courtship was slow, careful. I flinched at unexpected touches, withdrew when his kindness felt too close. But Daniel never pushed, never questioned my hesitations. In 1969, under a willow tree by the Tennessee River, I told him my story. The words came haltingly, my eyes fixed on the water's gentle ripples, afraid to see his reaction. I spoke of Mama's death, of Uncle Roy's abuse, of the night Dad ended it to save me. When I finished, there was a long silence. I braced for rejection, for pity, but he took my hands, his own trembling. You're not what happened to you, Clara, he said, tears in his eyes. You're who you've become, a woman stronger than anyone I know. His words broke something open in me, a floodgate of trust I hadn't thought possible. We married in 1970, a simple ceremony in a Knoxville church, surrounded by family, Dad, Martha, Tommy, Beth, and a few close friends. My dress was cream, sewn by Martha, with lace from Mama's old curtains. Daniel's steady presence was a balm, his love a quiet force that helped me navigate the lingering shadows. Our daughter Emily was born in 1972, a bright-eyed girl with my mother's smile. James followed in 1974, a serious boy who loved books as much as I did. Motherhood was both a joy and a challenge, stirring old fears, every cry in the night, every scraped knee triggering a protective instinct honed by my past. But it also brought a fierce determination to give my children the safety I'd lost. "I'll protect you," I whispered to Emily as she slept in my arms. A promise I renewed with James, a vow that echoed Dad's to me. Dad passed in 1985, a stroke claiming him at 62 while he tended the small garden behind Martha's house. His funeral was under a gray sky, rain falling as we laid him to rest beside Mama in the Knoxville cemetery. Martha, Tommy, Beth, and my children stood with me, a family forged through pain but held together by love. The rain soaked us through, but we didn't run for shelter, letting it wash our tears in a moment that felt like a cleansing, a farewell to the man who'd done what needed to be done to protect me. My faith grew slowly, not from church sermons, but from a quiet trust that even in darkness, there's a light that doesn't fade. It sustained me when Daniel was diagnosed with lung cancer in 1998, the disease claiming him a year later at 56. I cared for him at home, holding his hand through the pain, whispering the words he'd once used to comfort me. "Don't be afraid. I'm here." His death left a void, but also a certainty that our love transcended the physical, that he was still with me in some way I couldn't fully grasp. The years that followed were of rebuilding. I retired from teaching at 55 but stayed active, volunteering at a women's shelter in Knoxville, helping survivors of abuse find their voices. My own pain gave me empathy, a way to connect with women and children who felt as alone as I once had. Emily became a nurse, her compassion a mirror of Daniel's. James, a history teacher, married and gave me 4 grandchildren, bright sparks who call me Gran and beg for stories of the river and my childhood, though I share only the light parts, the fireflies and fishing trips, not the shadows. Now at 76, I sit on this porch, my hands worn but steady, my garden blooming with Mama's favorite flowers. I look back and see a girl who survived the unthinkable, not because she was unbreakable, but because she learned to mend. Her scars are part of her, marks of battles won, of a life reclaimed. If I could speak to that 10-year-old Clara, trembling in the wake of her mother's death and her uncle's betrayal, I'd tell her she's stronger than she knows, that the pain won't define her, that love and faith will light her way. I'd tell her she's not alone, that there are good people ready to hold her hand, that the God she'll come to know writes straight with crooked lines. If you're watching this and carrying your own scars, know you're not alone. Your story isn't over. The wounds that seem impossible to heal today can become part of your strength tomorrow. Share this video if it moved you, like it to spread hope, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and faith. We survive not just for ourselves, but to show others they can too. May you find light in your darkness, courage in your fear, and a voice to tell your truth.